Honey, there are moments in life when the ground just shifts beneath your feet, and you realize everything you thought you knew was wrong. For me, that moment came at my own son's wedding reception at the Magnolia Plantation, right here in Charleston, when my new daughter-in-law Jessica looked at me like I was something she'd scrape off her designer shoes. I'm Margaret Ellison, 78 years old, born and raised in the Holy City. I've lived through hurricanes, economic downturns, and more heartache than any one person should bear. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened that September evening when the Spanish moss was hanging heavy and the air smelled like jasmine and broken dreams. Let me paint you the picture. Here I was, wearing my best navy dress from Belk, the one I'd saved 3 months to buy, watching my Daniel, my only child, marry this girl from up north who'd never understood our ways. The reception was in full swing at the plantation's carriage house, with about 200 guests milling around, sipping sweet tea and champagne, when I noticed the waitstaff looking overwhelmed. Now, you have to understand something about me. I spent 32 years teaching culinary arts at Trident Technical College. I've catered more events than I can count, from debutante balls to church socials. When I see people struggling in a kitchen or with service, my instincts kick in. It's like asking a firefighter not to run toward smoke. So there I was, sleeves rolled up, helping serve drinks to some of Daniel's college friends from Clemson, when Jessica came sweeping over in her $3,000 dress. I remember thinking how beautiful she looked, how happy Daniel seemed, and how maybe, just maybe, we could find common ground in making his day perfect. "Oh, Margaret," she said, her voice carrying across the room like a dinner bell. "You don't need to do that. You're making the real staff uncomfortable." She paused, and I swear I could feel the temperature drop 10 degrees. Then came the words that would change everything. "Everyone, don't worry about her. She's just a waiter. She does this kind of thing." Just a waiter. Those 3 words hit me harder than Hurricane Hugo back in '89. I looked around at the faces, people I'd known for decades, folks whose children I'd taught, neighbors who'd eaten my Sunday dinners. Mrs. Patterson from Drayton Hall looked away. Tom Middleton from the Historical Society suddenly found his shoes fascinating. Even Reverend Williams from Emmanuel AME seemed to shrink into his collar. The worst part? Daniel didn't say a word, not one word. My son, the boy I'd raised single-handedly after his daddy died in that car accident on I-26, just stood there adjusting his bow tie and looking anywhere but at me. 37 years old, and he let his new wife talk about his mama like I was the help. But here's what Jessica didn't know, what none of them knew in that moment. Before I retired, before I became invisible in my own family, I'd been somebody. I'd won the South Carolina Culinary Championship 3 times running. I'd been featured in Southern Living magazine. I'd cooked for governors and celebrities when they visited Charleston. I'd built a catering business from nothing and sold it for more money than most people see in a lifetime. I quietly set down the tray of glasses, smoothed my dress, and walked toward the exit. My hands weren't shaking. I wouldn't give them that satisfaction, but my heart was breaking in ways I didn't know were possible. As I passed the gift table, I caught sight of the envelope I'd left there earlier. Inside was a check for $50,000, the down payment for the house Daniel and Jessica had been dreaming about on Rainbow Row. I was almost to my car, keys in hand, when I felt a gentle touch on my arm. It was Sarah Chen, a former student of mine who now owns that fancy restaurant on King Street, Peninsula Grill. She'd been quiet during the whole incident, but now her eyes were filled with something I couldn't quite place. "Mrs. Ellison," she whispered, glancing back toward the reception. "I could have sworn I saw you on the Food Network once. Wasn't there something about a cooking competition? Something big?" Sarah's words followed me home that night, like a ghost I'd tried to bury. As I sat in my little house on Trad Street, the same house where I'd raised Daniel, where I'd cried over bills and celebrated his every achievement, I found myself staring at the wall where my awards used to hang. I'd taken them down years ago when Jessica first visited, thinking they looked braggy, as she'd so delicately put it. "You want to know about sacrifice, honey? Let me tell you about the years after Robert died. Daniel was only 10, and suddenly I was a widow with a mortgage, a grieving child, and a dream that seemed impossible to hold on to. I'd been teaching part-time at the culinary school and running my catering business, Margaret's Magnolia Kitchen, out of this very house. I remember the night I almost gave up. It was 1995, and Daniel needed money for a school trip to Washington, D.C. All his friends were going, and I couldn't bear to see him left behind. I had exactly two options: keep my grandmother's complete set of signed first edition Charleston cookbooks, worth about $15,000, or sell them to pay for his trip and keep the lights on for another month. Those books had been in my family since before the Civil War. My great-grandmother had collected them, adding notes in the margins about which recipes worked best for different occasions. They were my connection to the women who came before me, who'd survived wars and disasters and heartbreak. But that night, I wrapped them carefully and drove them to the rare book dealer on Broad Street. "Are you sure about this, Mrs. Ellison?" Old Mr. Henderson asked me, his eyes kind behind his wire-rimmed glasses. "These have been in your family for generations." "My son is my legacy now," I told him, signing the papers with hands that barely trembled. "The recipes are all up here anyway," I'd added, tapping my temple. But that was just the beginning. When Daniel got accepted to the College of Charleston for business school, I sold my car and walked to work for 2 years. When he needed money for his MBA program at USC, I took a second job catering private parties on weekends, working 16-hour days until my feet bled in my sensible shoes. The real heartbreak came later, though. It was 2003, and the Food Network was just starting to really take off. They'd approached me about competing in something called Culinary Masters, a show featuring established chefs and teachers from around the country. The winner would get $100,000 and their own cookbook deal. I was so excited, honey. For the first time since Robert died, I felt like Margaret Ellison, the chef, not just Margaret Ellison, the struggling single mother. I'd even started practicing new techniques, modernizing some of my old family recipes. My friend Louise, she lived next door then, would come over and taste everything, giving me honest feedback. "Margaret, this is your time," she'd said, watching me perfect my signature dish, a low-country seafood tower with my great-grandmother's secret sauce. "You're going to show them what Charleston cooking really means." But then Daniel called from college. He was in trouble, not legal trouble, mind you, but academic trouble. He'd been partying too much, skipping classes, and was in danger of losing his scholarship. He needed me to come up to Columbia immediately, and he needed money for a tutor and to retake some courses. I stared at that Food Network contract for a long time that night. The competition was scheduled for the same week Daniel needed me. I could have told him to figure it out himself. Lord knows other mothers would have, but when I looked at his graduation photo on my mantle, when I thought about Robert and how proud he would have been, I knew what I had to do. I called the producer the next morning and withdrew from the competition. "Family emergency," I explained, my voice steady even as my heart was breaking. "I understand you can't hold my spot." Daniel never knew about that opportunity. I never told him what I'd given up to drive to Columbia that weekend and help him get his life back on track. And you know what? He graduated summa cum laude 2 years later and got a job at a big firm in Atlanta. That's when he met Jessica at some company party. She was everything I wasn't: young, sophisticated, from a wealthy family in Connecticut who'd never had to choose between dreams and duty. From the first time he brought her home, I could see how she looked at our little house, our simple way of life, our Sunday dinners that had been good enough for Robert and Daniel for all those years. But I kept hoping, kept believing that love would bridge whatever gaps existed between us. I never imagined that my own son would let someone make me feel small in my own hometown, among people who'd known me since I was a girl selling pralines at the city market with my mama. The phone was ringing as these memories washed over me. It was nearly midnight. Who calls at midnight with good news? But when I answered, my life was about to change in ways I never could have imagined. "Mrs. Ellison, this is Rebecca Martinez from the Food Network. I hope I'm not calling too late, but I've been trying to reach you for weeks." The woman's voice was warm, professional, and completely unexpected at nearly midnight on a Tuesday. I settled into Robert's old recliner, the one I'd kept by the window where I could watch the harbor lights twinkle like fallen stars. "I'm sorry, dear, but I think you might have the wrong person. I'm just a retired teacher from Charleston." She laughed, not mean, but knowing. "Mrs. Ellison, I've been researching you for months. 3-time South Carolina culinary champion, featured in Southern Living twice, owner of the legendary Magnolia Kitchen Catering Company. You were supposed to compete in Culinary Masters back in 2003, but you withdrew at the last minute. My heart started beating faster, but I kept my voice level. Years of hiding your light under a bushel will teach you that skill. That was a long time ago. I'm not sure why you'd be interested in an old woman's ancient history. Because we're launching something special, Rebecca continued. It's called Legends Return, a competition featuring accomplished chefs and culinary professionals who stepped away from the spotlight for various reasons. We want to give you a second chance at what should have been yours 20 years ago. I was quiet for so long that she asked if I was still there. Truth was, I was thinking about Jessica's voice earlier that evening, the way she'd dismissed me like I was nothing. I was thinking about Daniel's silence, about all those years of making myself smaller so everyone else could shine brighter. The winner receives $250,000 and a guaranteed cookbook deal with one of the major publishers, she went on. Plus, there's a possibility of ongoing collaboration with the network. Mrs. Ellison, your story, single mother, supporting your family while building a culinary career in the South, it's exactly what we're looking for. Part of me wanted to hang up, right then. At 78, what business did I have competing against younger, more trained chefs? My arthritis flared up on humid days, and I hadn't kept up with all the modern techniques and equipment. But then I remembered something my grandmother used to say. Margaret, honey, the good Lord doesn't give you dreams to keep them locked up in your heart forever. When would this be? I asked, surprising myself. Filming starts in 3 weeks in our New York studios. We'd fly you up, put you in a nice hotel, and give you a week to acclimate before competition begins. The whole process would take about a month. A month away from Charleston, away from the weight of being invisible in my own family, a month to remember who I used to be before I became just Daniel's mother, or apparently just a waiter. I told Rebecca I'd need to think about it and call her back in the morning. After I hung up, I sat in that chair until sunrise, watching the joggers start their morning runs through the historic district, watching the city wake up around me. I made myself a cup of coffee, community coffee with chicory the way we've always done it, and walked out to my tiny back garden. My tomatoes were coming in beautifully, and the basil was so fragrant you could smell it from the street. I'd taught Daniel to garden in this same spot, shown him how to tell when the okra was ready, how to coax the best flavor from fresh herbs. He used to love helping me pick ingredients for whatever I was catering that weekend. That's when I noticed the gate was slightly open, the one leading to the neighbor's yard. Louise had moved to a retirement community 2 years ago, and the new neighbors were nice enough but kept to themselves. But there, growing wild by the fence, was a patch of my grandmother's rosemary that had spread from my garden years ago. I walked over and pinched a sprig, rolling it between my fingers until the scent filled the morning air. Rosemary for remembrance, my grandmother always said. And suddenly, I could remember everything, not just the hurt from last night, but the joy I used to feel when I was cooking, creating, teaching young people to find their own passion in the kitchen. I walked back inside and opened the closet in my bedroom. Way in the back, behind winter coats I rarely needed in Charleston, was a box I hadn't touched in years. Inside were my culinary school certificates, my competition ribbons, photos from catering events, and newspaper clippings with headlines like "Local Chef Brings Charleston Charm to State Competition" and "Margaret Ellison, the Queen of Low Country Cuisine." There was also something else I'd almost forgotten, a business card from Jean-Claude Moreau, the French chef who judged one of my competitions in the late 90s. He'd been so impressed with my shrimp and grits that he'd asked for the recipe. If you ever want to train with real professionals, he'd written on the back, call me. I'd never called. Family came first, always. But Jean-Claude was probably in his 80s now, maybe retired to some little village in Provence, making cheese and growing grapes. Except when I Googled him on my tablet, Daniel had given it to me for Christmas 2 years ago. I discovered he was very much alive and running a small culinary consultation business in Manhattan. Before I could lose my nerve, I called Rebecca Martinez back. I'll do it, I said, my voice stronger than it had been in years. But I have one condition. I need 2 weeks to prepare, and I want to do it my way, with my own methods. No special accommodations, no sob stories. I want to compete on the strength of my cooking, nothing else. 3 days later, I was boarding a plane to New York City, carrying nothing but a small suitcase and my grandmother's cast-iron skillet. I didn't tell Daniel or Jessica where I was going. For the first time in 20 years, Margaret Ellison was putting herself first. New York City hit me like a wall of sound and motion, but honey, after surviving Hurricane Hugo and raising a teenager as a single mother, I wasn't about to be intimidated by a little urban chaos. Jean-Claude Moreau met me at his restaurant in Soho, a tiny place called Memories that served the kind of food that makes you weep with happiness. He was smaller than I remembered, silver-haired now with laugh lines around his eyes, but when he smiled and took my hands in his, I felt like that confident chef from 20 years ago instead of the invisible woman from my son's wedding. "Margaret," he said, his French accent still thick as honey after all these years in America. "I saw your name on the contestant list, and I said to myself, finally someone with real soul is returning to competition. You look exactly the same, ma chérie." I laughed, probably for the first time since that awful night. "Jean-Claude, I'm 78 years old and haven't competed in anything harder than the church bake sale in 20 years. I look like exactly what I am, a grandmother who's probably lost her mind." "Non," he said firmly, leading me to his kitchen. "You look like a chef who remembers why she fell in love with food in the first place. That is something you cannot teach, something most of these young people on television never learn." For the next 2 weeks, Jean-Claude put me through what he called boot camp for the soul. We started at 4 in the morning, working in his kitchen before his regular staff arrived. My hands, soft from years of just cooking for myself, developed calluses again. My back ached from standing for hours, but it was a good ache, the kind that comes from doing work that matters. "Show me your signature dish," he said on the second day, gesturing toward his gleaming kitchen. "Cook like you're cooking for someone you love." I closed my eyes and thought about Robert, about Daniel as a little boy, about all those Sunday dinners when our house on Trad Street felt like the center of the universe. Then I started cooking my low-country seafood tower, but not the fancy version I'd developed for competitions. This was the original, the one my grandmother taught me when I was 12 years old, standing on a step stool in her kitchen. I could feel Jean-Claude watching as I worked, but I didn't look at him. Instead, I let my hands remember what they'd always known, how to coax the sweetness from shrimp, how to build flavors layer by layer, how to make something that didn't just feed the body but nourished the soul. When I finally plated the dish, grits creamy as silk, shrimp and scallops perfectly seared, and ouille sausage, adding just the right amount of heat, all topped with my great-grandmother's secret sauce, Jean-Claude took one bite and closed his eyes. "This," he said quietly, "this is why you will win." But winning wasn't even on my mind during those intense days of training. I was remembering who I used to be, rediscovering muscles I'd forgotten I had, not just physical ones but creative ones. Jean-Claude introduced me to techniques I'd only read about, helped me modernize my presentations without losing the soul of my cooking. The other thing that happened was unexpected. The young cooks in Jean-Claude's kitchen adopted me like I was their culinary grandmother. Maria, a line cook from Puerto Rico, helped me understand how food television had changed since my day. Jake, a pastry chef from Oregon, taught me new plating techniques, and Sophie, a culinary school student from France, reminded me that cooking was supposed to be joyful, not stressful. "Chef Margaret," Sophie said one evening, as we cleaned up after a particularly challenging practice session, "why did you stop competing? Jean-Claude says you were legendary in the South." I paused, up to my elbows in soapy water, thinking about how to explain 20 years of putting everyone else first. "Sometimes life requires you to make choices," I said finally. "I chose my family. I don't regret it. But maybe it's time to choose myself for a change." The night before filming began, Jean-Claude took me to dinner at a quiet bistro in the village. Over wine that probably cost more than I used to spend on groceries in a month, he gave me advice that had nothing to do with cooking technique. "Margaret, you are going to meet chefs half your age who have twice your formal training. They will have studied in Paris, worked in Michelin-starred restaurants, won James Beard Awards, but you have something they don't have." "Arthritis and crow's feet," I joked, but he wasn't smiling. "You have a story in every dish you cook. You have love and loss and resilience. You have the wisdom that comes from cooking, not for critics or cameras, but for people you care about. That is your secret weapon." That night, alone in my hotel room overlooking Central Park, I called Louise back in Charleston. She was the only person who knew where I was, the only person I'd trusted with my secret. "How are you feeling, honey?" she asked. "Terrified," I admitted, "and more alive than I've felt in 20 years. And Daniel? Have you told him yet?" I looked out at the city lights, thinking about my son and his new wife, probably settling into their routine back home, probably not even noticing that I hadn't called or stopped by in 2 weeks. "He'll find out soon enough," I said. "Tomorrow, when the cameras start rolling, everyone will find out, including Jessica, who thinks I'm just a waiter who doesn't know her place." The Food Network studios were nothing like I'd imagined, bigger, brighter, with more cameras than a space shuttle launch. But when I walked into that kitchen wearing my lucky apron, the one with Magnolia Kitchen embroidered on the front, something shifted inside me. I wasn't Margaret the invisible mother-in-law anymore. I was Chef Margaret Ellison, and I had every right to be there. There were 12 of us competing, and honey, Jean-Claude had been right. These were some seriously talented folks, a James Beard winner from California, a molecular gastronomy expert from Chicago, a farm-to-table pioneer from Vermont. Most of them were young enough to be my children, and a few looked at me like I was their grandmother who'd wandered into the wrong building. But then the first challenge started, and everything else disappeared. "Comfort food with a twist," announced the host, Alex Morrison, who I'd watched on TV for years. "You have 90 minutes to create a dish that tells your story." I closed my eyes for just a moment, and I was 8 years old again, standing in my grandmother's kitchen on Sullivan's Island, watching her make what she called Sunday supper for the soul, mac and cheese, elevated with 3 kinds of artisanal cheese, topped with a crust made from crumbled cornbread and country ham, the whole thing finished with a drizzle of honey truffle oil. My hands moved without conscious thought, building flavors like I was conducting a symphony. I could hear the other contestants running around, stressing over molecular techniques and fancy presentations, but I was in my element, cooking the way I'd learned from women who'd survived wars and raised families, and never forgot that food was love made visible. When time was called, I looked down at my plate and smiled. It wasn't the most complicated dish on the counter, but it was mine, honest, soulful, and telling the story of 4 generations of Charleston women who'd passed their secrets down through taste and touch rather than written recipes. The judges tasted in silence, but I caught the moment when Chef Roberto Mendez, a man who'd earned 3 Michelin stars, took his first bite and his eyebrows shot up in surprise. When they got to the critique, he leaned forward and said, "Margaret, this isn't just comfort food, this is comfort food with a PhD in Southern hospitality. How long have you been cooking professionally?" 56 years, I said simply, and I watched his expression change from polite interest to genuine respect. I won that first challenge, and honey, when they announced my name, something inside me that had been sleeping for 20 years woke up roaring. But the real moment came afterward, when a production assistant handed me my phone to check messages during our break. 17 missed calls from Daniel, 23 text messages, and 1 voicemail that I played with shaking hands. "Mom, what the hell? Mrs. Peterson just called Jessica screaming about seeing you on the Food Network. Are you actually on a cooking show? Why didn't you tell us? Call me back immediately." I looked at that phone for a long minute, then turned it off and handed it back to the production assistant. "I'll deal with family drama after I finish what I came here to do," I told her. But the real validation came from an unexpected source. During lunch break, my phone buzzed with notifications from social media accounts I'd barely used. Someone had posted clips of my cooking segment online, and people were responding in ways that made my heart swell. This is what cooking shows used to be about: real people with real stories, not just flash and technique. My grandmother cooked exactly like this woman. You can see the love in every movement. Finally, someone on these shows who looks like they actually eat their own food. But my favorite comment came from someone with the username Chef Saraches. "This is my former teacher, Margaret Ellison from Charleston. She taught me everything I know about cooking with soul instead of just skill. She's a legend who's been hiding her light under a bushel for too long." Sarah Chen, my former student who now owned Peninsula Grill, one of Charleston's most respected restaurants, she'd recognized me at the wedding, and now she was telling the world what Jessica and Daniel had never bothered to learn. The second challenge was even better: Mystery Box, where we had to create a restaurant-quality dish from ingredients we couldn't see beforehand. When I lifted that box and saw shrimp, okra, tomatoes, and rice, I actually laughed out loud. "Something funny about your ingredients, Margaret. asked Alex. Honey, I said, grinning at the camera, these aren't mystery ingredients to me. This is Tuesday night dinner in Charleston. Y'all just handed me my grandmother's jambalaya recipe. I could feel the cameras following me as I worked, but for the first time in decades, I didn't mind being watched. I had nothing to hide, nothing to apologize for. I was exactly where I belonged, doing exactly what I was born to do. When judging came around, Chef Mendez took one spoonful of my jambalaya and actually moaned, "Margaret, this is what food television needs more of. This is honest cooking, technique perfected through decades of practice, flavor that tells a story. You're not trying to impress us, you're trying to feed our souls." I won that challenge too, and suddenly I wasn't just participating in the competition, I was leading it. That night in my hotel room, I finally listened to all of Daniel's messages. They progressed from confused to angry, to something that almost sounded like panic. The last one from Jessica was the most telling. "Margaret, people at the country club are asking us about your cooking career. We had no idea you were, well, we just think you should have discussed this with us first." I was about to call them back when my phone rang. It was Rebecca Martinez, the producer, and her voice was electric with excitement. "Margaret, you need to see this. You're trending on social media. The Food Network website crashed from traffic, and we just got a call from Random House about cookbook rights." By the final week of competition, something extraordinary had happened that had nothing to do with cooking and everything to do with connection. Viewers weren't just watching legends return, they were falling in love with the idea that it's never too late to reclaim your dreams, never too old to show the world what you're made of. The producers told me I was getting more fan mail than contestants half my age. Social media was flooded with photos of grandmothers, cooking family recipes, tagging them with #CookingWithSoul and #MargaretEllison. Food Network's website had created an entire section dedicated to viewer-submitted family recipes, calling it Margaret's Legacy Collection. But I tried not to let any of that get to my head. I was down to the final 3 contestants: myself, Marcus from California, the molecular gastronomy expert, and Elena from Vermont, the farm-to-table pioneer. All of us had earned our places through skill and determination, and I respected the hell out of both of them. The final challenge was the most personal yet: cook the dish that defines who you are as a chef. You have 2 hours, access to any ingredient in our pantry, and the chance to show America what makes your culinary voice unique. I knew immediately what I was going to make, but it wasn't something I'd prepared in the practice sessions with Jean-Claude. It was something deeper, more personal: my mother's recipe for resurrection cake, the dessert she'd made every Easter when I was growing up, and every time our family needed healing after loss. It was a complex layered cake that told the story of Charleston itself: bourbon-soaked layers representing our complicated history, praline cream filling for the sweetness we'd found despite hardship, and a delicate caramel glaze that caught the light like Spanish moss in sunshine. But the real magic was in the technique: 7 different processes that had to be perfectly timed and executed, the kind of baking that separated good cooks from great ones. As I worked, I felt the presence of every woman who'd taught me something about cooking: my grandmother with her steady hands and patient voice, my mother with her insistence that every dish should feed the soul as well as the body, even my students at Trident Tech, who'd reminded me that teaching is just another form of love. With 30 minutes left on the clock, disaster struck. My caramel seized, turned grainy and unusable in a way that would have sent younger chefs into panic mode. But honey, when you've been cooking for 56 years, you learn that disasters are just opportunities in disguise. Instead of starting over, I pivoted to something my grandmother had taught me during the Depression: how to turn broken caramel into something even better. I added cream and bourbon, whisked it until it became a smooth, boozy sauce that I knew would complement the cake layers perfectly. Then I made a new glaze using honey and butter, something that would shine on camera and taste like childhood summers. "Time," called Alex, and I stepped back from my station with flour in my hair and caramel on my apron, feeling more myself than I had in 20 years. The judging was intense. Marcus had created something that looked like edible art, all molecular techniques and surprising flavors that made the judges gasp with delight. Elena's dish was a perfect representation of sustainable cooking, featuring ingredients she'd grown herself and techniques that honored the earth. Then they got to my cake, I watched their faces as they cut into the layers, revealing the complex interior that had taken decades to perfect. Chef Mendez took the first bite, closed his eyes, and was quiet for so long I thought something was wrong. Finally, he opened his eyes and looked directly at me. Margaret, this isn't just a dessert. This is a story, a tradition, a piece of culinary history that you've kept alive through your own hands and heart. This is why cooking matters. Judge Sarah Williams, a James Beard Award winner herself, was actually tearing up. In all my years of professional cooking, I've never tasted anything that so perfectly captures the intersection of technique, tradition, and pure love. This cake tastes like home, even for those of us who've never been to Charleston. When Alex Morrison announced that I'd won, my knees actually buckled. $250,000, a cookbook deal with Random House, and a recurring guest spot on Food Network shows. But more than that, I'd proven something to myself that I'd forgotten over the years. Margaret Ellison was never just anything. The other contestants surrounded me with hugs and congratulations that felt genuine, not forced for the cameras. Marcus, who was young enough to be my grandson, whispered in my ear, "You didn't just win a competition, you reminded all of us why we started cooking in the first place." That night, there was a celebration dinner for all the contestants and crew. Jean-Claude flew down from New York to be there, bringing champagne from his personal collection. But the moment that meant the most came when Rebecca Martinez pulled me aside. "Margaret, we've never had response like this to a contestant. The network wants to discuss some opportunities. Maybe a show focused on traditional techniques, or a series about cooking through the generations. Are you interested?" 2 months ago, I would have immediately thought about what Daniel would say, how Jessica might react, whether it would be too much trouble for everyone else. But standing there in that New York restaurant, surrounded by people who valued my skills and respected my story, I gave her an answer that surprised us both. "Rebecca, honey, I'm 78 years old, and for the first time in decades, people are seeing me for who I really am instead of who they need me to be. So yes, I'm very interested in whatever opportunities you want to discuss." My phone had been buzzing all evening with calls and texts from Charleston. Daniel, Jessica, old friends, former students, even people I barely knew who'd somehow gotten my number. But there was one message that stood out from all the rest, and it was going to change everything when I got home. The message that stopped me cold was from Jessica, and it was nothing like her usual brief, somewhat condescending texts. This one was 3 paragraphs long, full of words like amazing and proud and family celebration. She wanted to throw me a welcome home party at their new house, the one my $50,000 gift had helped them buy, though she didn't mention that. I stared at that message for a long time, sitting in the first-class seat that Food Network had booked for my flight home. 3 weeks ago, Jessica had dismissed me as just a waiter in front of half of Charleston's society. Now she wanted to celebrate my success as if she'd been cheering me on all along. The thing about getting older, honey, is that you develop a kind of radar for people's motivations. Jessica wasn't suddenly proud of me. She was suddenly aware of what my success might mean for her social standing. Being the daughter-in-law of a Food Network champion was a lot more impressive at country club brunches than being related to just a waiter. When my plane landed in Charleston, I half expected to see Daniel waiting at the gate like he used to when he was younger, and I'd come back from catering trips. Instead, I collected my bags alone and took a taxi home to Trad Street, where everything looked exactly the same but felt completely different. I'd barely gotten my key in the lock when Louise appeared from next door. She'd driven over from her retirement community the moment she saw my taxi pull up. "Margaret Ellison," she practically shouted, pulling me into a hug that smelled like White Shoulders perfume and victory. "I have been so proud I could bust. Everyone at Magnolia Creek has been watching every episode, cheering like you were our own granddaughter." We sat on my front porch with sweet tea and caught up properly. Louise filled me in on all the neighborhood gossip, but more importantly, she told me about the reaction in Charleston to my television appearances. "Honey, you should see the way people's attitudes have changed," she said, fanning herself with the church bulletin she'd been carrying. "Suddenly everyone remembers eating at events you catered, or having their children in your classes, or knowing all along that you were something special." "And Daniel?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Louise's expression grew more serious. He's been calling around town asking people why they never told him about your cooking career. Apparently, he had no idea about the competitions, the magazine features, any of it. He seemed genuinely shocked. That evening, as I was unpacking my suitcase and trying to figure out where to put the trophy they'd given me, Daniel's car pulled into my driveway. Through the window, I watched him sit there for several minutes, like he was gathering courage for something. When he finally knocked, I opened the door to find my son looking more uncertain than I'd seen him since he was a teenager caught sneaking in past curfew. "Mom," he said, and his voice cracked slightly on the word. "Can we talk?" I let him in, poured him coffee in the mug I'd bought him for his college graduation, the one that said "World's Best Son" that I'd never had the heart to throw away, and waited for him to find his words. "I had no idea," he said finally. "All those years, all those achievements, and I never knew. How did I not know?" I could have said many things in that moment. I could have reminded him of all the times I'd tried to share my work with him, only to be met with polite disinterest. I could have pointed out how Jessica had made it clear that my past was embarrassing, something to be minimized rather than celebrated. Instead, I told him the truth that I'd been avoiding for years. "Daniel, you didn't know because I didn't want to burden you with having a mother who might outshine you. I made myself smaller so you could feel bigger. That was my choice, and maybe it was the wrong one." He was quiet for a long time, stirring his coffee with the intensity of someone trying to solve world hunger. Finally, he looked up at me with eyes that reminded me of his father. "Jessica wants to have a party for you. She's already started calling people, making plans." "I know," she texted me. "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. At the wedding, when Jessica said that thing about you when she dismissed you like that, was I supposed to defend you? Did I let you down?" There it was, the question that had been sitting between us like a wall. I looked at my son, this man I'd raised, to be kind and successful and good, and I realized that part of his current confusion was my fault. By always putting his needs first, by never demanding respect for myself, I'd taught him that my feelings were less important than everyone else's comfort. "Yes, Daniel," I said gently, but firmly. "You were supposed to defend me. You were supposed to say, 'That's my mother you're talking about, and she deserves better,' but you were also raised by a mother who never taught you that she deserved defending." The party happened the following Saturday at Daniel and Jessica's house on Rainbow Row, the house my money had helped them buy. Jessica had gone all out, catered food from Peninsula Grill, a nice touch, hiring my former student, flowers from the best florist in town, and invitations that managed to mention both my Food Network victory and her own role in supporting family dreams. It was surreal standing in their living room surrounded by people who'd watched me be humiliated at the wedding just weeks earlier, now toasting my success and talking about how they'd always known I was special. Jessica fluttered around in a designer dress, introducing me as our celebrated chef and basking in reflected glory like a sunbather in August. But the real shock came when I overheard Jessica talking to her mother on the phone in the kitchen, and what I heard made my blood run cold. She wasn't celebrating my success. She was already planning how to use it. "No, Mother, you don't understand the opportunity here," Jessica was saying into her phone, her voice carrying that particular tone people use when they think they're being clever. "She's got book deals, television appearances, probably endorsement opportunities. If we play this right, there could be real money involved." I stood frozen in the hallway, holding 2 empty appetizer plates I'd been taking to the kitchen, listening to my daughter-in-law plan my future like I was a stock portfolio she'd discovered in the attic. Daniel could probably manage her career, take a percentage, and with our connections, we could really maximize her earning potential. She's old. How much longer can this last? We need to capitalize while people still care. Capitalize. That word hit me like a slap across the face. I set those plates down carefully on the hall table, smoothed my dress, and walked back into the party with a smile that probably looked more dangerous than it felt. For the rest of the evening, I watched Jessica with new eyes. Every compliment she gave me, every time she steered conversation toward my television appearances, every moment she positioned herself as the supportive daughter-in-law, it all made perfect sense now. I wasn't family to her. I was a business opportunity that needed proper management. But here's what Jessica didn't know about me, what she'd never bothered to learn in all the years she'd been dismissing me. Margaret Ellison had been running her own business since before she was born. I'd negotiated contracts, managed money, built relationships, and made strategic decisions that kept my family fed and my business thriving for decades. The Monday after the party, I had lunch with Sarah Chen at Peninsula Grill. Sarah, who'd recognized me at the wedding, who'd posted about me on social media, who'd hired my catering company for her own events, and actually understood what I'd accomplished. "Mrs. Ellison," she said, over she crab soup that would have made my grandmother proud. "I hope you don't mind me asking, but what are your plans now? The Food Network offers, the cookbook deal, that's a lot to manage." I smiled at this young woman who'd learned to cook in my classroom, but had grown into a businesswoman who understood both food and finances. "Sarah, honey, I've been thinking about that myself. Tell me, what would you do if you suddenly had more opportunities than time?" "I'd find people I trust to help me make the most of them," she said without hesitation. "But I'd make sure they understood that it's my vision, my story, my decisions." That afternoon, I called Rebecca Martinez at Food Network and asked for a meeting to discuss those opportunities she'd mentioned. But first, I made another call to the lawyer who'd handled my catering business years ago, Jonathan Fletcher, who was now one of Charleston's most respected entertainment attorneys. "Margaret," he said when his secretary put me through, "I've been watching you on television and bragging to everyone that I used to eat your catering food. What can I do for you?" "Jonathan, I need someone who can help me navigate some business opportunities without letting anyone take advantage of an old woman who's been out of the game for 20 years. Within a week, Jonathan had reviewed all my contracts, negotiated better terms with the publisher, and helped me establish Margaret Ellison Culinary Enterprises, a company that would manage my television work, cookbook sales, and any future ventures. But the project that excited me most was something I'd been dreaming about since winning the competition: the Margaret Ellison Culinary Scholarship for students from low-income families who wanted to pursue careers in the food industry. I put $100,000 of my prize money toward the initial funding, and Sarah Chen agreed to help me set up partnerships with local restaurants for internships. John Claude flew down from New York for the announcement, which we held at Trident Technical College in the same classroom where I'd taught for 3 decades. The local news covered the scholarship announcement, and I got to stand in front of cameras for the right reasons, not as someone's forgotten mother or dismissed in-law, but as Margaret Ellison, chef and educator, investing in the next generation of culinary artists. "This scholarship isn't just about cooking techniques," I said into the Channel 5 camera. "It's about understanding that food is culture, food is love, food is how we take care of each other. These students will learn not just how to prepare meals, but how to nourish communities." After the press conference, I was walking to my car when Daniel appeared, looking like he'd been waiting for me. "Mom, we need to talk. Jessica thinks you should have discussed this scholarship thing with us first. That's a lot of money to just give away." I stopped walking and really looked at my son. This man I'd raised to be successful, who'd married a woman who saw dollar signs where others saw generosity. "Daniel," I said quietly, "it's my money to give away. I earned it, I won it, and I'm using it for something that matters to me. Jessica doesn't get a vote in how I spend my resources." "But Mom, think about your future. What if you need that money for healthcare? What if I need to live with dignity and purpose instead of just security?" I interrupted. "What if making a difference in young people's lives is more important to me than making sure there's enough left over for an inheritance?" His face went very still at the word inheritance, and I realized that Jessica's influence ran deeper than I'd thought. That night, I made a decision that I'd been avoiding for months. I called Jonathan Fletcher and asked him to come to my house the next morning. It was time to make some changes to my will, changes that would ensure my legacy went to people who valued what I'd actually accomplished, not what they could get from it. Sometimes the hardest conversations happen in the most ordinary places. For me, that place was my own kitchen on a Tuesday morning in October, with autumn light streaming through the windows where I'd watched Daniel grow up, where I'd planned 1,000 meals and dreamed 1,000 dreams. Jonathan Fletcher sat at my kitchen table with legal documents spread between us like battle plans, explaining the changes I'd asked him to make to my will. The scholarship fund would receive the bulk of my estate, along with substantial donations to the Trident Technical College culinary program and the Charleston Food Bank. My house would go to Louise, who'd been more family to me than some people who shared my blood. "Are you sure about this, Margaret?" Jonathan asked, his voice gentle but professional. These are significant changes. Have you discussed them with Daniel? Jonathan, I've spent 37 years discussing my decisions with Daniel. It's time I made some that are just mine. As if summoned by our conversation, I heard car doors slamming in my driveway. Through the window, I saw both Daniel and Jessica marching toward my front door with expressions that would have soured fresh milk. Looks like I'm about to get that discussion whether I want it or not, I told Jonathan, who quickly gathered the documents. I'll step onto the back porch, he said diplomatically. Call me if you need me. I opened the door before they could knock, because I'd learned that facing difficult conversations head-on usually works better than letting them build momentum. Daniel, Jessica, what brings you by? Jessica pushed past me into the living room like she owned the place, which, given what I'd overheard at the party, she probably thought she eventually would. Mother Margaret, she said, using the fake sweet voice that had always made my teeth itch, we need to discuss your recent decisions. People are talking. People are always talking, Jessica. What specifically has their tongues wagging today? Daniel, to his credit, looked uncomfortable with whatever ambush they'd planned. Mom, someone told Jessica that you were meeting with lawyers about your will. We're just concerned that you might be making emotional decisions without thinking through all the implications. Emotional decisions, I repeated slowly. You mean like giving money to help young people pursue their dreams instead of saving every penny for people who've never shown much interest in my dreams? Jessica's mask slipped just a little. That's not fair. We've always been supportive of your hobbies. Hobbies. I sat down in Robert's old chair and really looked at these two people who'd somehow convinced themselves they had a right to plan my future. Jessica, what do you think I did for 32 years at Trident Tech? You taught cooking classes, she said impatiently. I ran a professional culinary program that graduated over 2,000 students, many of whom now own their own restaurants or work in major hotels across the Southeast. I developed curriculum, managed budgets, supervised other instructors, and built partnerships with industry professionals. That's not a hobby, that's a career. I stood up and walked to the mantel, where I'd finally hung some of my awards and certificates again after taking them down years ago to make Jessica more comfortable. And my catering business wasn't a hobby either. I built it from nothing, served everyone from governors to celebrities, employed dozens of people over the years, and sold it for enough money to fund Daniel's education and still have plenty left over. Daniel was looking increasingly uncomfortable, but Jessica was just getting started. That's all very impressive, but you're 78 years old. You need to think practically about your future needs, about family responsibilities. Family responsibilities, I said quietly. Let me tell you about family responsibilities, Jessica. I sold my grandmother's cookbook collection to pay for Daniel's school trip. I worked 2 jobs to fund his college education. I withdrew from a major television competition to help him through a crisis he never even knew he put me through. I walked back to where they were sitting and remained standing, claiming the advantage of height in my own living room. I sacrificed my dreams for 20 years to make sure my son had every opportunity to chase his. Now I'm finally chasing my own, and instead of celebrating that, you're worried about how it affects your inheritance. Mom, that's not, Daniel started, but I held up my hand. Daniel, honey, let me ask you something. When was the last time you asked me about my day? Not my health, not whether I needed anything, but what I was thinking about, what I was excited about, what mattered to me beyond my function in your life. The silence that followed was answer enough. And Jessica, when you told everyone at your wedding that I was just a waiter, what you were really saying was that my life's work, teaching young people, building a business, creating something meaningful, was so unimportant that you didn't even need to acknowledge it. Jessica's face was flushed now, angry in the way people get when they're caught being exactly who you thought they were. I think you're being overly dramatic about an offhand comment. Dramatic? I laughed, and it wasn't a happy sound. Jessica, I heard you on the phone at your party talking to your mother about managing my career and capitalizing on my success. You weren't celebrating my achievements, you were calculating their value to you. Daniel's head snapped toward his wife. Jessica, you didn't. I was thinking about family opportunities, she said defensively. There's nothing wrong with that. There's everything wrong with that, I said firmly. You don't get to ignore me for years, dismiss my accomplishments, treat me like hired help, and then suddenly become my business manager when I become profitable. I walked to the front door and opened it, letting the October breeze carry the scent of Confederate jasmine through the room. I've made my decisions about my estate, and they're final. The money I earned will go toward causes I believe in and people who've actually supported my dreams. If you want to rebuild a relationship with me, that starts with respecting who I am, not what I might leave you. As they left, Jessica stomping, Daniel looking back with something that might have been regret, I stood in my doorway watching them drive away in the car my money had helped them buy. That evening, I received an email that changed everything. The first scholarship recipient had been chosen, and she wanted to meet me. Her name was Maria Santos, she was 19 years old, and her letter of gratitude was about to teach me something about family that I'd forgotten in all those years of trying to hold on to people who'd never really wanted to be held. Maria Santos had the kind of hands that told a story, calloused from years of working in her family's restaurant, scarred from burns that come with learning to cook on equipment that's older than you are, but gentle when she shook mine in the lobby of Peninsula Grill where we'd arranged to meet. "Mrs. Ellison," she said, and her voice carried a slight accent that reminded me of my grandmother's stories about the families who'd come to Charleston seeking better lives. "I don't know how to thank you for this opportunity." We sat down to lunch, and she told me her story. Parents who'd immigrated from El Salvador, a family restaurant that barely broke even, dreams of culinary school that seemed impossible until my scholarship made them real. "My abuela taught me to cook the way your grandmother taught you," she said, over Sarah's famous she-crab soup. "With love first, technique second. But I want to learn everything: classical French methods, modern presentation, business management. I want to honor where I come from while building something bigger." Listening to Maria talk about her dreams, watching her eyes light up when she described her plans, I realized something that took my breath away. This was what family was supposed to feel like. Not people who tolerated you or used you or dismissed you, but people who shared your values, who built on what you'd built, who honored your legacy by creating their own. Over the following months, I watched Maria flourish at Trident Tech, just as I'd watched hundreds of students before her. But this time was different, because this time I wasn't just teaching, I was mentoring, investing not just in her education but in her future. She worked weekends at Peninsula Grill, where Sarah Chen took her under her wing the way I'd once mentored Sarah. She practiced new techniques with the intensity of someone who understood that opportunities like this don't come twice. And every few weeks she'd stop by my house with samples of dishes she'd created, asking for advice, sharing her excitement, treating me like what I was, a chef worth learning from. My Food Network appearances became regular monthly segments, and I used each one to highlight young chefs like Maria, turning my platform into a bridge between generations of cooks. The cookbook, Cooking with Soul: Recipes and Wisdom from a Charleston Kitchen, became a bestseller, with all proceeds going back into the scholarship fund. But the real satisfaction came from quieter moments. Louise and I took a trip to Paris, where Jean-Claude showed us the bistros where he'd learned to cook, and I realized that at 78, I was still capable of new adventures. I started hosting intimate dinner parties at my house again, cooking for people who appreciated both the food and the woman who'd prepared it. Daniel and I found a new rhythm, not the one we'd had before where I gave everything and expected nothing, but something more balanced. He started calling just to talk, asking about my television appearances, even admitting that he'd started watching cooking shows to better understand my world. Jessica was Jessica. She maintained a polite distance that suited us both, occasionally posting on social media about her celebrity chef mother-in-law when it served her purposes, but no longer pretending we were close. The real change came 18 months after that awful wedding reception, when Maria graduated from culinary school with highest honors and a job offer from a prestigious restaurant in Atlanta. The graduation ceremony was held in the same auditorium where I'd taught for 3 decades, and when they called her name, I was as proud as I'd ever been of anything. At the reception afterward, Maria found me talking with some of my former teaching colleagues, people who'd known me when I was building my career instead of just someone's mother. "Mrs. Ellison," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I have something for you." She handed me an envelope, and inside was a photo. Maria, in her new chef's coat, standing in the kitchen of her new restaurant with a handwritten note on the back. "For the woman who taught me that it's never too late to bloom, and never wrong to insist on being seen for who you really are. But there was something else in the envelope, a sealed letter with "For Daniel" written in my handwriting. She'd found it among the scholarship papers, something I'd written months ago but never sent. "I think," Maria said gently, "that some things need to be said even when they're hard to say." That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with the letter in front of me. I'd written it during one of those long, quiet nights when you finally understand how your story fits together, when you can see the patterns that were invisible while you were living them. Inside was everything I'd never been able to tell my son: how much I'd loved raising him, how proud I was of the man he'd become, but also how much it had hurt to watch him let someone else define my worth. I'd written about the choices I'd made, the dreams I'd deferred, and the new life I was building at an age when most people think life is winding down. But mostly, I'd written about forgiveness, his need for it, my willingness to give it, and the understanding that families can rebuild themselves if both sides are willing to do the work. I drove to Daniel and Jessica's house that evening, and this time I didn't call first. When Daniel answered the door, I simply handed him the letter and said, "When you're ready to read this, we can talk about what it means." A week later he called. "Mom," he said, and his voice sounded like it had when he was small and needed comfort after a nightmare. "Can I come over? I think we have some things to figure out." As I write this story, Maria is sous chef at her Atlanta restaurant and engaged to a young man who lights up when she talks about her cooking dreams. Daniel and I have dinner together once a month, just the two of us, rebuilding our relationship on more honest ground. Louise and I are planning a trip to Italy to study pasta making with actual Italian grandmothers. And me? I'm Margaret Ellison, chef, teacher, author, and television personality. I'm someone's former mother-in-law and someone's scholarship benefactor and someone's cooking inspiration. But most importantly, I'm someone who learned that it's never too late to stop being invisible and start being yourself. The letter I left for Daniel is still sealed in my desk drawer, waiting for the day when he's ready to read about the woman his mother really was all along. And when that day comes, I think we'll both be ready for whatever conversation follows.